A recurring and seemingly eternal problem that the anime community has long faced is people being unwilling to watch older anime. What exactly defines older anime, of course, is going to change over time. We're at the point where there are people who would argue earlier than 2015, 10 years ago, is an old anime, and that is very awkward to think about, considering that's around the time I started to get into watching anime. But because of that, if we're already dealing with people saying 10 years ago is old anime, what does that mean for shows that are even older? And because so many people getting into anime do have this reluctance to watching older shows, how many things are they going to miss out on simply because it's not new and fresh? And that is one of the primary reasons people don't want to go back and watch older shows, because it may not be something that people are actively discussing at the moment. I can understand that to an extent, but I also think that you should not just be watching anime to discuss it with people. You should be watching it also so that you can enjoy a piece of media, and that should not be dependent on when it came out. The other factor, and the factor that I think has been more prevalent over time, is the animation quality. And this especially goes for anime pre-digital. For a while, it felt like to me, a lot of people had a cutoff of like 2000 as the year determining if something was new or old. And that kind of made sense with respect to that being when the transition from hand-drawn to digital was. But regardless of where you draw that line, the mere fact that people are drawing it is the concern, because so many shows get left by the wayside by people who are just not willing to give them a chance. And in the case of the show we're discussing today, yeah, you're going to see a lot of people who will not give it a second thought because of its age, because The Rose of Versailles is from 1979. We're talking about a 46-year-old series, and that is often enough to just make people completely ignore it. It does have character designs and an animation quality that people are going to look at and say, I don't like how this looks, and that's enough for them to not be willing to give it a chance. That is unfortunate, because this is a genuinely really fantastic series, one that should not be written off because of its age. And given that we have the new movie adaptation of The Rose of Versailles coming out on Netflix at the end of April, I felt like it was a good opportunity to discuss the original Rose of Versailles and try to convince people that, regardless of the fact that there's a new, shinier, prettier version of it out there, this original 40-episode series is absolutely worth your time and attention. The Rose of Versailles has an interesting history in terms of how the story progressed from start to finish, especially when you go back to the original manga. Originally, it was supposed to be focused around Marie Antoinette. She was the main character. And even though you had other characters running around who were prominent, it was envisioned as her story. Ultimately, the creator was convinced that, hey, this is a character who has an already known endpoint. We know what her history is, and unless you want to completely do away with historical accuracy, you cannot change that. So ultimately, the decision was made to have a original character who was already a part of the story take center stage as the protagonist, and that, of course, is Lady Oscar. Oscar is a fascinating character, not just because of the role that she has in this story, but because of the influence she has had across anime. So many characters, both male and female, have been inspired by Oscar in terms of her design, in terms of her prominence, in terms of what she represents as a main female character who is carrying out a role that, especially for the 1700s, only a man would normally be able to do. Just her very existence is a big step forward for equality, showing that you can have this strong female character doing things that go against traditional gender roles and not be constantly belittled and demeaned for it. Not that that doesn't happen, but it's not like her entire story is just, oh, you can't do this because you're a woman. Like, there's more to her than that. She's not just a vehicle to serve this purpose. She is a fully fleshed out character. And importantly, she's one that does kind of blur the lines a bit, because yes, she is born a woman. She is basically expected to take on the role that a son would normally take on because her father doesn't have any sons, but she hasn't completely abandoned aspects of her femininity, but also embraces this traditionally masculine role that she has taken on. She doesn't completely hate what she's doing. She's not like the kind of character who is forced to act like a man and hates it. No, she sees aspects of herself representing both of those roles. So exactly how you'd want to define her is perhaps a little bit difficult, but personally I think that makes her all the more impressive as a character, that she can represent so much for so many different people and so many different identities. She doesn't neatly fit into certain boxes and certain existing definitions, and I really appreciate that. When the anime adaptation came out, Oscar was very clearly meant to be the main character from the get-go, and that is an example of something being handled with more foresight when the anime came out as opposed to the original manga. That is something that can't be said for every aspect of the anime, however, because there is a character who has a very interesting history in the manga and anime. And I think if the anime had come out later than it did, further removed from the original release of the manga, I think there would have been the hindsight to sort of alter the role that she played. And that character is Rosalie. If you've seen my previous videos discussing the upcoming Rose of Versailles movie, you'll have heard me discuss how I think Rosalie is a character who probably should not feature that prominently in said movie. Now, the movie is out in Japan. We know a little bit about it. I do not know exactly what role Rosalie had, but certainly in all of the promotional material, it seems like the new movie doesn't feature her that heavily and may only feature her in her historical role. The anime features her fairly prominently, and like 99% of her relevance in the anime is not historical. Now, there are a number of ways in which the original Rose of Versailles story and the anime are different from historical reality. It does follow the general significant beats of the lead up to the French Revolution, but there are differences between how things play out in the anime and how they do in reality. They're close enough, they're similar enough, but if you know what happens to some of these characters in real life, you'll see, oh, that's not what happened. That happened differently. This happened earlier than it did in real life, etc. Rosalie is definitely the biggest example of this, not just because her history is so much more expanded compared to what she did in real life, but also she is given these connections to characters that are historical figures and are in the anime that she does not have in real life whatsoever. Rosalie is introduced very early on in the story. She is presented as being the adopted sister of another character who is a historical figure and plays a very important role with regards to Marie Antoinette. And then later on we find out, oh, Rosalie is the daughter of this other French royal who is relevant in terms of French history, in terms of the anime, and that's not historically accurate either. So they basically decided to give this one historical character, Rosalie, connections to two other historical characters that she did not have in real life. And all of this ends up amounting to Rosalie becoming a very prominent figure around the midway point of the show. It's very clear the intention was to have her become a part of this main cast trio with Oscar, with Andre, and then her. I remember very vividly this one shot, and I don't recall the episode off the top of my head, where all three of them are on their horses staring off into the distance. It's like, yeah, this is the point where the show is saying these are our main characters now. And it's not too long after that Rosalie suddenly gets written out of the story for a significant period of time. The reason why this happens is because I guess fans of the original manga were not super thrilled with Rosalie, and ultimately the creator made the decision to scale back her role. Now, under normal circumstances, if that happened, you would just cut the character out entirely and be done with it. The problem, though, is that Rosalie is historical, and she had not done her historical role yet, because her role in history is literally just that she is like the attendant to the maid, whatever you want to think of her as, to Marie Antoinette before she got executed. That is her role. It's very simple. It's certainly, relevant. I mean, this is a figure who is remembered in history, but that's it. And in the grand scheme of things, that is not all that much, especially with regards to this anime. And while we do eventually see that towards the end of the show, it's not like it's a very long, drawn-out thing. We don't spend a lot of time with her interacting with Marie Antoinette in that context. But because that still had to happen, because the only reason she's even in this story to begin with is because of that historical role, you couldn't write her out permanently. So towards the end of the series, she is brought back in a supporting role, still doing non-historical stuff, before eventually having her historical role take place at the very end. So she's just a very weird character once you've seen the show and you think back to it, because she is someone who really didn't need to be this prominent, but there was clearly a desire on the part of the creator to make her prominent, to make her a main character, only for the decision to be made to basically write her out of the story because I guess she wasn't super popular. And that's why I say if the anime had come out later And certainly in any new adaptation that comes out, like in the new movie, or if there ever is an additional adaptation later on, it really wouldn't make sense to include Rosalie at all. Like, you could just have her show up at the very end for her historical role and not have her be there at all, because it is kind of jarring to introduce this character, have them have these connections to all these other characters, build them up, make them a main character, a part of a trio of protagonists, and then write her out. It's definitely one of the weaker parts of the show, that it's clearly going in a certain direction with this character, and then suddenly it veers off in a different way. And that's why, if you wanted to retell this story, if you wanted to streamline it, if you wanted to make it flow better, you probably wouldn't include Rosalie at all. Or alternatively, you just wouldn't write her out of the story and you would keep her going on that original route where she is a member of this trio of main characters. That's another option. That's certainly something that somebody could do at some point. But obviously, if you're doing a streamlined version, like doing a movie adaptation, it's better to just cut her out entirely, which is why my expectation for the upcoming movie is that she shouldn't have that much of a role, because if you're looking to trim fat, it's right there. It's right there staring you in the face as the most obvious thing to cut out of the story. Rosalie having these non-historical connections to historical characters are not the only historical changes the show makes. So if you are somebody who really values historical accuracy, if you know your French Revolution history well, yes, there are going to be things about it that bother you. If you don't really care about that sort of thing, you're not going to mind. Or if you can separate historical accuracy from just a good story, you should be fine as well. But it is something that people need to keep in mind, that yes, this isn't 100% historically accurate. And while a lot of that does have to do with Rosalie and the two historical figures that connections are made to in the story, there are other things here and there that don't quite play out exactly the same way as they do in real life. But again, it is a fictional story. And while I do think that, yes, the primary appeal of the premise here is that you're taking a historical event and you're inserting a handful of non-historical characters, Oscar, Andre, etc., to enhance the story and add additional depth to certain characters. And you don't really expect there to be too much historical divergence other than things regarding them specifically. I think that it is something that people can look past, because a lot of these details are not things that most people who just have a basic understanding of the French Revolution are going to know. Most people are not going to even know who Rosalie is, or if she had any sort of historical relevance. She is not something that you're going to be taught when you're learning about the French Revolution. So I think it is forgivable, even if, yes, it does kind of bother me knowing, hey, you probably didn't need to have these changes. You probably could have had it be more historically accurate. And again, because this idea of remaking it, doing a more streamlined version has been in my head for so long because of that original Toei planned movie adaptation from back in 2007 that never ended up happening, and probably in some way inspired the MAPPA movie that's coming out. I've had in my head ideas of how can you streamline the story, how can you trim things out, how can you make it flow better, and one of those ways honestly is to just make it a little bit more historically accurate and reduce the changes that are made for the sake of certain characters that either don't need them, or in the case of Rosalie, probably shouldn't be there in the first place. It's around the middle of the story where Rosalie is having her prominence and the drama regarding her connections to other characters are at the forefront that I'd say the show is probably at its weakest, primarily due to pacing issues. It does feel like the show is dragging certain things out and it doesn't quite have the consistency of flow that I think it really should have had. And this is a common complaint you see people bring up with older anime, that they don't really know how to do their pacing well and that they're longer than they should be. And I can't exactly say that that doesn't apply here, but I do think it's not nearly as bad as it can be with other series. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we get into the last 13-ish episodes, my God, the pacing is on point. More on point than I've seen in a lot of anime, both old and new, because the show completely locks in and knows exactly what it's doing, exactly what it needs to build up to. And the tone of this series during its last third is nothing short of fantastic. The dread in the atmosphere, the knowledge that things are going to get worse for a lot of these people. A major historical event is about to happen, and you know it as the viewer. The characters don't know it. And seeing how things change, how things subtly get darker and darker, how the unease that everyone has, this feeling that something's going to go down, and they don't know it, but you do. And that honestly really enhances the story. The fact that we should all know what's going to happen with the French Revolution. We know how it ends. We know which historical characters survive and which ones don't. Having that foreknowledge really, I think, enhances the viewing experience. It's almost like when you rewatch a series and you know where it ends and you have that foreknowledge to sort of see things that you wouldn't have picked up on a first viewing. It is remarkably well handled. And I think the build-up to that final bang where everything ignites and the revolution starts is remarkable. If I were to criticize something about the ending of the show, it is that the very last scene you get is basically the narrator giving us exposition. And that's never great. I do feel like this is stuff that we should have seen, that the last episode definitely needed more breathing room, maybe one more episode, a 41st episode, to pace things a little bit better. Because even though, yes, I've just spent the past however many minutes praising the last third of the show for its pacing, the last episode definitely is rushed at the very end because the fates of certain characters, certain historical events are just kind of told to us verbally by a narrator as the show is fading to black. That is not good. That is never good. And that is either something that we should have seen happen, and you could have the narration over it while we're seeing the animation. I could have accepted that. Or we should have just had more breathing room so it didn't feel so abrupt and sudden. It does leave a bit of an awkward taste in my mouth. That being said, it is something that over time I've come to forgive because the rest of the end of the show, the rest of that last third is just so strong. And what it does, not just in terms of building up to the revolution, but what it does for Oscar and Andre and their development and their relationship is really incredibly well done. So for all of those reasons, this is a show that is not just good for a show from 1979. It is a good show, period. And it's one that, yes, has its flaws, as many shows do. It could have been trimmed down. It could have been more historically accurate. It could have had more breathing room in the end. It could have had the foresight potentially to handle certain characters differently. But by and large, what the show does is truly great. And the impact that it has left in terms of how certain female characters are designed, how they're written, the prominence that they have and deserve to have in other shows, it makes it worthwhile even just for its historical relevance. But the fact that it is a genuinely great show on top of being a relevant one for anime history means that you really should not brush it off just because it's old. So yes, we do have a new version coming out. Yes, it is going to be shorter because it's just a movie. Apparently it's going to be a musical, so that will be interesting. But just because you're going to have a shiny, fancy new version of the story doesn't mean that original version is not worth watching. And I strongly implore you, if you have the time between now and when that movie comes out, and even if you're watching this video after the movies come out, please watch the original Rose of Versailles. I know it's not going to be the easiest thing to find. I know, yes, it is 40 episodes. That's not as quick to watch as a movie. But I think, one, your enjoyment of the movie will be enhanced if you've seen the original version. And two, even if you have seen the movie already, you should not skip out on the original version of the story because it's going to flesh things out more because it's longer, and it's going to prove once and for all for a lot of people, I hope, that just because an anime is old, just because its animation quality may be dated, doesn't mean you shouldn't give it a chance. Because if you ignore older anime, whether it be anime pre-2015, anime pre-2000, anime from the 90s, 80s, 70s, whatever, if you write them off just because of their age, you're going to be locking yourself out of so many amazing series. Yes, they may not have the same level of discussion that modern series have, but if you are someone who watches anime because you want to experience a fulfilling story, I hope that the Rose of Versailles will prove to you you don't need to only look at the newest of the new to get those fulfilling experiences. Even shows from 46 years ago can do it, and can do it better than many shows coming out today. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time, take care everyone. Look forward to the next video.